and I want to thank everybody for their beautiful compliments and for participating in the session so greatly. So I'm still on my take a break slide, and then we go to the board members checklist. So I have got to caveat myself when it comes to this part of the talk. I am a checklist freak. I love any checklist. So we'll talk a little bit about my own OCD at a later stage, but I think it is a tremendous ask to really talk about a board members checklist. And I want to put a bit of a different spin on it today, because I honestly do think that there isn't a single one checklist. And if we go back to those 7 habits of win-win attitude, I think it doesn't truly depend on where you are on your journey, but that you are on the journey. And that's really important from a board member perspective. When we are placed in a position of trust of an organization to not only better the organization from a profitability point of view, but to govern that organization to the best of our ability, there's a tremendous amount of accountability on our shoulders. And not only Professor, but Toby also mentioned that this accountability of a board member is really pivotal. When we look at how global legislation is being developed, more and more countries are legislating the fact that if you are found negligent in leaking private data or putting your company at risk when it comes to cyber resilience, you will run the risk of serving jail time. I think GDPR was one of the first pieces of legislation that held board members personally accountable, not only in their capacity as a board member, but in their personal capacity for breaching or being negligent with people's private information. So this really comes to that, where would we start with a checklist for something actually truly so serious? We need to start by asking, and my slide design slightly cut off the bubble, but I'm excellent at giving advice that I never follow. But what I want to say tongue in cheek with this picture is, before we assess any checklist, we need to ask who is publishing the checklist. Because when we do that, do we squarely put any kind of advice in a bucket? And that's how I want to consolidate today's talk about how do we come up with a real checklist for a board member. When we Google cybersecurity checklists, and rather interesting, I did some research on what Google publishes. In the beginning of every year, the searches relating to cybersecurity checklists increase to an equivalent to the searches of getting thin and becoming fit. So most people have New Year's resolutions as to better themselves, not only from a fitness and health perspective, but also from a cybercrime perspective. And I think that's a good attribute to have, that we start off the year at least with the intent to do better. It's really important to understand that that search result soon nosedives through February and March as life happens and people continue on their merry way. But when we Google cybersecurity checklist, there's a number of checklists that come up. But it goes back to that slide as to who's giving the advice of a checklist. So when we look at it from a purist point of view, most of those checklists originate out of one of 3 buckets. And I am probably going to break you now for checklists for the rest of your life. So I do apologize up front, because the next time you look at a checklist, you're going to look at a checklist and go, but who published it? Who's giving the advice? A wise mentor of mine once said, don't take advice from somebody you won't take criticism from. So let's start in our buckets. The first lot of advice or checklists available out there are usually published by auditors or governance, risk and compliance organizations. This is really important to understand, because it is in their core business interest to have something to go by to validate their advice. And this is really good. So please understand, I'm by no means criticizing this as an approach. I want your mind to be sharpened as to who do you receive advice from. When we take a checklist off the internet, or from an auditing company, or from a governance risk and compliance organization, we need to understand that that advice or checklist originates from that audit framework, from that understanding the risk and compliance factor. When we look at the middle bucket, all large technology organizations, in some shape or form, come up with advice. How to do this better, how to do this smarter. Some of this is based on some of the technology company, I want to say it, thought leaders like Gartner. Those are in most cases agnostic of any singular technology, which makes them rather good advice. But all organizations, including the one that I work for myself, publish these technology, and I don't want to really call them checklists, but technology advisory pieces from time to time. So we have to acknowledge the fact that when we take a compliance document or a checklist document from any technology company, that we may find that it is heavily weighted towards a specific technology or towards a technology stack in general. Or when it comes to the Gartner and the Forrester reports, it talks about a specific discipline. And this is really important to understand, because in this discipline of cybersecurity, we have validated across the industry that there are certain key disciplines: endpoint protection, threat analytics. All of these key buckets have got congruent technologies across different vendors. And those congruent technologies should support a certain feature richness. We can take the firewall as an example. Most large tech companies produce some form of a firewall in some way, shape, or form, be it in the cloud, be it on the premise, be it wherever. All of those firewalls should have a similar feature set to a large degree. And what these independent tech organizations do is they look at those sets and they effectively summarize it on your behalf. They look at how they perform and they measure that against a few yardsticks, which is really important. The last bucket of advice or checklists that we find in the public domain or lying around is that of government. So this is very important, that this is an advisory piece. And earlier on the commentary, and please, if I didn't answer your question, please post them again. And if I don't get to it today, I promise you I'll answer it in email. But there was a question around the maturity or how serious the government is about cybersecurity if they haven't promulgated the final Data Privacy Act. Now, I've been unable to do the exact research as to where India's Data Privacy Act is, but I want to say that it's not unique to India. I actually find that globally, most countries are still lagging behind on adopting data privacy regulations in a mature fashion. When we even look at the European countries, when GDPR, everybody would have remembered, it was 25 May, everybody was running around trying to get compliant with GDPR. That cutoff date was 2 years after the publishing of GDPR. So 2 years after the publishing date of GDPR, countries were still scrambling to get some form of compliance in place. So it's not unique to any country that some of these legislation pieces are lagging behind. But what most governments have come up with, they've at least come up with white papers, advisory pieces, or general frameworks in which they advise large organizations should comply with. And to a point that Professor made earlier, that a lot of the critical infrastructure now sits within private hands. The loss of critical infrastructure can break the economy. So most governments have smartened up on that piece of legislation. So we always have to understand that with the ample amount of legislation that governments have to release to govern good society. They do what needs to be done first. So if there is a threat on the power grid, like again, there's been instances, they need to regulate cybersecurity around critical infrastructure. Because if any country loses their whole power grid, the economy will come to us. It will knee halt to the whole company, and the economy will come to a grinding halt. So it's rather important that we understand this prioritization and where this advice comes from. So governments usually come up with some blanket framework that can be followed. And what does that mean? Each of these buckets are trying to protect something. We all have some kind of agenda as to what drives our input into these frameworks and checklists that we're trying to derive out of this. So, but let's quickly have a discussion into some of the global statistics when we have a discussion around what are we protecting against when we look at these checklists. 33% of devices hacked, 55% of intrusions being low tech. Low tech effectively plays on the fact that it wasn't some sophisticated hack. It was by delivery of an email. It was clicking on malware in an ad. So 50% of your risk as an organization lies within that first part of my talk around cyber resilience culture. 48% of intrusions are human error. So most of these are perpetrated by our employees. Cybersecurity as a crime is one of the biggest investment buckets at the moment, and we're not even talking about cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, but we're seeing almost 40% year-on-year growth. 66% of online adults have been hacked. So most of us has some form of an online presence, be it a LinkedIn profile, be it Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, whatever our online, Instagram. And when I deal with the children, there's even more, TikTok, Snapchat, all of these kind of platforms. 66% of adults that have access to some form of an online presence have been hacked. And then until now, most of these countries battle with legal frameworks, as one of our participants noted. Where are these leaks happening when we look at data privacy specifically? Because most of the world have sharpened themselves and sharpened the blade as to understanding that this privacy thing is really becoming a motion in itself. A big part leaks through email, endpoint, and websites. This is almost 3/4 of all data leaks that happen through only those 3 points: email, endpoint, and website interfaces. So this is really important to understand when we look at a checklist. How do we start prioritizing risk? And we're going to get to the actual checklist part. So now we're back at our 3 buckets. When we understand what's coming out of the industry and we understand where these advisory boards are coming from, I wanted today take the best of all of these and put them together into a single checklist. And then we'll have a discussion around that, because a checklist is not where it ends for us as board members. And we really have to think a little bit further as to the assets of our organization. So firstly, when we look at the auditor or GRC checklists, they mainly focus around understanding risk. This is a very, very, very important part of any checklist, that we need to have the ability to understand the risk. And as a little bit of homework, seeing to the fact that you're going to get the slide deck, I want you to go Google a checklist and bring it up and have a look at it. And you'll see that if it originates out of an auditing company or a GRC organization, that it mainly talks about understanding the risks within your organization, because they're talking of a point of knowledge. And that is how they, as part of a bigger industry, sees the resolution to cybercrime. The middle component or bucket talks about the technology answer. And those are always very good reads, because it's rather important, firstly, to understand What are the new feature sets that's being developed to be able to protect against the tomorrow? Remember, whatever technology acquisition we do today, firstly, we need to have the ability to simplify our lives. We need to have the ability to be as effective and as quickly to respond to threats as we can. And ultimately, we are trying to solve a bigger problem, an organizational problem. Never should we look at technology as, I need a data leak prevention technology, so I'm going to get a data leak prevention technology. That is not the way to think about it from a board perspective holistically. Technology should be jointly, synergy, working together for a bigger outcome. Then our government piece. Our government piece and advice will see the language that it's drafted in really talks about protecting the economy. And it talks to that example that I've given around defining critical infrastructure as power grids, water supply, the stock exchange. Those kind of economical strongholds need to be protected at a higher rate of efficacy than any business in the country. Because if we lose the ability to trade stock, the currency will die. If we lose the ability to supply power, most businesses will come to a grinding halt. And if we lose the supply of water or any of these core and critical socioeconomic functions, a whole country can be brought to its knees. And we've seen this. When we talk about what Professor said in terms of the 18% of breaches being interstate and state-sponsored, we are aware of global state-sponsored attacks that brings another nation to its knees. Like, for instance, the Ukraine hack, where the power grid was switched off for 2 weeks. It brought the Ukrainian people to their knees. These kind of, and this is what the government is trying to protect against, these kind of hacks that can really bring the economy to its knees. And therefore, when we pick up advice drafted by the government, we need to understand where it comes from, where it originates from, and what is the main purpose. Okay, but before I go into the actual checklist, I want to discuss some of these because I want you to widen your thoughts a little bit. ISO 27001, one of my pet projects, I want to say. These days it's a pet project. In the past it was a full-time career, but the reality being, this is clearly an auditing framework. It's a governance framework that's put in place as an information system management system that is cross. But when we look at the language, and that's what I want to stress today, when we look at the language, it talks about understanding the organizational context, scope of the project, leadership involvement, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, and improvement. Did any of those ring a cybersecurity bell? Not necessarily, but all of those are critical checkpoints into how do we become compliant on a repetitive manner and in a mature way when it comes to governance risk. This is a very nice example from an ISO perspective. When we look at the essential 8 controls, similar, this is a little bit closer to home, rings a little bit more familiar when we talk about cybercrime. Prevent attacks, do application control, patch applications, configure Microsoft Office macros, user application hardening, restrict admin privileges, patch operating system, multi-factor authentication, and then daily backups. Some of these should ring a bell when we had the hygiene conversation. These are considered the essential 8 controls. Again, does it make what we say in the legal terms a closed list of checklists? Not necessarily. It probably is lacking because it only talks to certain of the technology controls. It doesn't talk wider into the greater organization. Again, great checklist to start off with. Furthermore, 15 ways, I always love these, 15 ways to protect your business from cyber attacks. It almost looks like the front page of some fitness magazine. 15 ways to get thinner thighs in February. I would like that copy. But look at what they're saying. Security assessments, email phishing, passwords. We've mentioned all of this during the run of this morning, and it's been a tremendously good conversation. Look how congruent things come up. Multifactor authentication, computer updates, dark web research, interesting one to add to a checklist, backups, encryption, firewall. This one talks a little bit about technology, but it also talks a little bit about assessments. So it's a bit of a mix between all of what we can see. And this one is by a solutions organization in Cambridge, actually, which is a really good authoritative academic figure. So where do we start? And when I was asked to do this, like I mentioned, I found it tremendously interesting and challenging this topic together, because I soon realized that there isn't a golden list, but I'm being asked to come up with as close as I can to the golden list when it comes to cybersecurity. So what is the key? In my personal opinion, I think balance is the key. Again, we need to remember our three buckets: governance, risk and compliance, and audit, technology, and government. On one of the questions earlier today, there was an ask about how this reporting gives insight to financial reporting. We are absolutely getting there. The financial institutes are going to, in the future, ask us about our cyber resilience. They're going to ask us about our cyber frameworks. They're going to ask us, these things are going to start walking hand in hand. In the country where I come from, I think it was mentioned that I was born in South Africa. There's a massive drive in securing mobile cash machines and ATMs, because there is a discipline in the crime units to blow them up. So they plant bombs around them and then they blow them up, and as the cash blows into the sky, they go and collect what they can and they run off with the money. So the banks had to be ingenious as to how do they secure those mobile ATM units. And they actually place dye inside the canister. So if the explosive go off, the money gets stained and it's unusable. But that is a socio-economic development of a crime driver. So are the banks smartening up to our investment portfolio? As an ISO 27001 lead auditor, the biggest amount of audits that I've ever been involved with is due diligence audits. I would be called in as part of the due diligence of acquiring a company, and the acquisition company would ask me, how cyber resilient is this company? And I would go in and audit. Why? Because that's where their money lies. Investors have smartened up to, where does the money go if this organization goes down? How do I protect my investment in this organization by ensuring they're cyber resilient? So in my honest opinion, when we take our three buckets, we need to start with balance. We need to take the best of each of those pockets in checklists, and we need to create a singular checklist that represents all of those facets. And I made the best attempt I could. I would welcome anybody that differs with me, and I love open debate. So here goes. Firstly, we talk about our buckets again. The first bucket, we want to understand the risk. In that risk, a good start always is to do a security assessment. Some organizations offer security assessments as part of their technology as well. You can do an email security assessment as part of the technology stack. How secure is your email in your organization? But some of these security assessments are larger and really go throughout your practices, your policies, throughout the whole organization. Determine critical infrastructure. This is really important. As a board, how do you ask your IT department, what is the most critical IT asset? They need to determine What is going to break the bank when it gets lost and when it gets hacked? And this is the bottom line, guys. If we don't know what are our critical infrastructure, we can't protect it. So as a board, you cannot approve funding for a project within IT if IT cannot validate whether that is a critical infrastructure point. If it is a critical infrastructure point, in my opinion, you will be negligent if you don't invest against protecting it. Prioritize the risk. So if that critical infrastructure is a shared data center that is backed up in 3 different other data centers across 3 countries, and the data is encrypted, and if you lose the primary, there's 3 backups and all of it is encrypted and only a few people have access to it, what is our risk? Our risk is much lower than a CEO PC with all the IP and intellectual property on it that's roaming around the world on flights and on planes and on public Wi-Fi. So what we need to do is we need to really understand our assets and we need to prioritize our risk. What is the chance of us being breached on that specific asset? Once we understand that fully with the help of a security assessment, the board jointly with the managing executives of the organization need to decide on an audit framework. And there's a multitude of them out there. There's many frameworks that can be implemented from an IT perspective. You also have the ability to develop your own framework that is a mixture between from COBIT to NIST to ISO and do your own mixture. There are very, very good audit frameworks out there. But as an organization, you need to find something that is fit for purpose and fit for your organizational culture. Then we pivot to the technology checklists. And in that technology checklist, I cannot stress it more. I think when I showed the previous slides as to what these technologies show, 2 of them showed multi-factor authentication. Okay, if I can put anything on a checklist from a technology perspective, multi-factor authentication would be it. Why is that? Identity is the new firewall. So if I'm working from home, and again, the audience has stressed that we don't have enough focus on security while working from home, and somebody logs in, I have to validate that identity. How do I validate that identity? By verifying it a second time, by verifying either the person, something you are, something you know, something you have with multi-factor authentication. Therefore, if that password gets leaked or that device gets compromised, nobody can get access to critical information without authenticating. Understand that we stop the attack right there. So I cannot stress multi-factor authentication enough. I even run it on my Gmail. And if you don't run it on your Gmail, it is free. You can just go and enable it. Gmail does it on your behalf. Then the second technology advice that I've taken from all of the lists that I've reviewed is that get visibility. And I think Prof actually said it on my behalf. He said it so nicely. He said, stop, find, fix. I can't stop it if I can't find it, and then I can't fix it. Visibility onto my network. Who's communicating with who? Are they doing data exfiltration? Are they hoarding data? What are the controls that's important to my organization to really talk to, I can see what's happening and therefore proactively react. So as a board member, as a management member of an organization, I want you to go ask your IT, call your head of IT in and say to him, what visibility do you have on the network? Can you now tell me everybody that's on the network and what they're accessing? And if he can't tell you, I'm telling you, you're at very, very large risk. It is critical that organizations have visibility into their information flow. Without that visibility, we can't make smart decisions. We can't navigate this technology world without seeing what's going on in there. And then the last thing, based on 81% of breaches out of my first part of my talk, is protect your email. People, we have to protect our email. Email is not just critical private information. It is the lifeline of our business. It is the lifeline of business today. It is how we communicate, how we transact. When I do social hacks as demos at events or at awareness campaigns, I always get into somebody's mail. And when I'm in your mail, I have access to a copy of your bank details. I usually can get access to some private information in your archives. I have such vast and rich information about the person that it is critical that we protect our email if we start anywhere. Then when we look at protecting the economy, this is really important. It doesn't only talk to the financial part, but in a business environment for a board member, it surely does. So what we need to do is we need to ensure that critical financial assets are under zero trust. Zero trust is not a new technology concept. Zero trust allows ubiquitous least privilege. So what it is saying is, I know who is accessing what and that they have the right to do it. Why does the general administrator have access to a payroll system? They shouldn't. But if your IT department can't tell you that they are accessing it by accident or not, it's not helpful. So if we can kick off any kind of project to protect where the money lies, we need to ensure that at least, and I'm saying at least because zero trust as a posture for a whole larger organization is tremendous. But if you have to start somewhere, start with your financial assets. Your financial assets needs to have a zero trust principles behind it, and it needs to have a heightened login, additional login user credentials. And then ensure backup policies and procedures are in place. I think this is really important. And if you remember what I called out from a cyber resilience culture point of view, the two big words in how we define resilience, the one being to be able to recover. So we need to have the ability to go to a previous state when we are affected. When ransomware attacks us, we need to have the ability to have a near normal state that we can roll back on. So these are, and if you count quickly, the 9 key ones that I've called out. So to make it a round list of 10 for our checklist, I said, train your people. It talks to the first part of my talk where it's so important that we have awareness campaigns and we train our people as to why cybersecurity is important and how to enact it. So let's quickly have a look at it. And what does all of this actually mean? When we represent this in a sphere, the big game changer, and somebody posted a really nice article about defending versus attacking. And if you look at all of that, the big game changer on it is ultimately the data. So we work from the outside in the biggest sphere into the data. We start with our policies, procedures, and awareness. We work into our physical security, our building access, our data center access, who gets in where to get physical access to our assets. Then we talk about our perimeter security. How do we secure the network, the firewall? How do we connect into our critical assets through VPN? And there are tremendous groundbreaking work around SASE, secure access service edge kind of methodologies that's now taking great momentum in the industry and is a really good read. I'll share some information around that. Then we go into the network, the host, the application, and ultimately to the data as we secure what we have on our network. So let's have a look at our checklist in Finality again. I was asked to put a checklist together for a board member, and I decided to stop at 10 because I do think we lose concentration. I lose concentration after 3, but I'm trusting that you as board members have the ability to concentrate all the way up to 10. So my trust is in you. The first one being, let's have a good start. Get an assessment of where's your organization. And again, that win-win attitude from our previous talk, if you've already done an assessment and you've done some work to get compliant with what the outcome of the assessment is, be critical of that outcome and make sure that those projects are tracking on point. because that is ultimately how you're going to protect your organization. Determine critical infrastructure. How do we know what is going to kill our business if lost? If we don't know what is our critical infrastructure, we can't protect, and we can't do the third, which is prioritize our risk. Then decide on your audit framework. Only once you understand what is critical to your business and you know what is your biggest risk, can we start saying, but how do we want to phase our audits in to secure and create a practice and a discipline that is mature and repetitive? Because that's ultimately what audit frameworks look at the long run. Technology bucket, create multi-factor authentication, implement multi-factor authentication, use multi-factor authentication. I can't stress it enough. Get visibility. We can't protect against what we can't see. We don't know what's coming if we're blind. Protect our email. Email is the lifeline of our organization. If I were to, any CEO or board member, if you ask him, if you were to lose all email connectivity for a week, what would that mean to your organization? He will probably tell you, I'm dead in the water. I can't transact, I can't live, we can't do anything. If something is such a critical asset to your organization, please go and protect it. Please make sure that you have the right tools in place to protect it. Ensure critical financial assets at least are under zero trust. Again, zero trust is for the larger part of the organization, but if we have to start somewhere and your organization has done nothing to become zero trust compliant, it is critical that we start with the financial assets. Okay. Ensure backup policies and procedures are in place. Policies and procedures are the outside sphere. It's where we start inwards to the data. Policies, procedures, and awareness, which is the 10th point, training your people. Train your people. There are policies and procedures in place, where to report, how to set securely, who's allowed on what VPN, are you supposed to use VPN when you're off net? All of those will be given insight from determining your critical infrastructure and prioritizing your risk. If we've done those, we can be smart about putting our backup policies and procedures in place. But before I go, and before I close out for questions, I want to leave you with this image as the effects of cybercrime. Cybercrime critically affects our privacy, our intellectual property, our equipment. If something has been locked with ransomware, the machine is formatted and re-imaged, if you're lucky. It's very rare that you recover anything, and I can tell you I'm a digital forensic auditor. It was my job at one stage of my life to recover data for people. It's really rare that we recover that equipment. Okay. Cybercrime is after our financials. They break our policies and our data. So I want to now overlay that image with our checklist. Because when we do security assessments, we can't only focus on one vulnerability scan by a tool. It has to be organization-wide because we have to take all of those factors into account. When we determine our critical infrastructure, we can't only look at the financials. We need to look at the equipment that is part of that critical infrastructure. We need to look at the intellectual property that might be hosted in the cloud that is part of a critical infrastructure. If Coca-Cola loses the recipe to Coke, would you consider that as a critical infrastructure? So outside of the 4 or 8 or 10, I've heard so many different numbers, people in the world that knows the recipe, where do they store it? Prioritize your risk. What is the most important thing to your organization? If the most important thing to your organization is its reputation and its data, then that's where we start with prioritizing our risk, but understand it in the bigger sphere of the effects of cybercrime. Audit framework, again, multi-factor authentication. Not only does multi-factor authentication protect our privacy, it protects our data, it protects our equipment, it protects our financials, definitely, and ultimately our intellectual property. If I can lock somebody out at the point of intrusion, remember 55% of hacks on that previous slide is low tech. They don't hack into your network, they log into your network. All of those can be stopped with multi-factor authentication. Get visibility. We cannot fight what we cannot see. Again, we need to stop, find, and fix. We can't stop, find, and fix if we can't see. Protect our email. Email is critical, critical, critical. It sits on our equipment. It hosts our data. It's got the privacy of our organization in there, as well as our intellectual property. Ensure critical financial assets are under zero trust. Again, zero trust is a organization-wide concept, but if we have to start somewhere, we need to start with something regarding our financial assets. So how do we log into the banking systems? How do we do payroll? Where does that payroll sit? Who's got access to that payroll? All of those financially implicated systems need to be zero trusted. Okay, ensure backup of policies and procedures are in place. These are disciplines. If your organization is mature, they do it on a repetitive way. If you look at the advice of ISO, they do it on a repetitive way. It is documented, it is measured, and it is reviewed annually to improve. Continuous improvement is critical. So in our win-win attitude, if you've done this for years and you haven't reviewed it in the last 3, please go review your backup policies and procedures, or have somebody have a look at it for you. And then ultimately train your people to protect privacy and data, and understand the criticality of intellectual property for the organization. Understand how important equipment is. And if somebody is walking out of the building with a laptop, that is critical information and intellectual property that's leaving the organization. So it's really important that we train our people with all of those themes in mind when we look at awareness campaigns. Lastly, we need to understand that resourcing against cybersecurity is one of the critical threats. And I closed out the checklist already, but I want to leave you with something to think about. Within your organization, there are people responsible for securing the cyber safety of your organization. Do you know who those people are? And are you invested in them? I'm saying, are you as an organization invested in those brains that is protecting your organization at the moment? Do you even know who they are? And do you have a plan for their well-being? Because if you don't, they will churn. It is the biggest brain drain in the world at the moment. We don't have enough cybersecurity skills in the world, and we can't play catch up even. It is important that you understand who is responsible, and in that you help them, because we're talking about the element of people versus automation. If your cybersecurity people are asking you for tools and they can validate the importance of that, it is important to lend your ears to that. It is important that we secure your good cyber defending assets, and those are your people. The people that sit in your SOC, the people that work in your NOC, the people that defend first line, your CISO, those people are looking after the resilience and the cybersecurity. It's important that we empower them with the correct tools in the environment. Remember, fostering, it's got 3 elements: psychology, sociology, environment. Ensure their development. You need to invest in those people, because by investing in those people, we can create a culture of loyalty, and you have a counter investment back in your organization. Some of the largest hacks that I've consulted on were insiders, disgruntled employees, people that had the logs of the firewall, that accessed it, that opened it up because they were leaving, because they were upset at a manager, because they were upset at things that happened in the organization. Make sure that you understand who your people are, and then automate where possible. I cannot stress this enough. With the lack of skills in the industry, it is critical that you spend your time and your brain power to automate. I'm going to share an article with you guys about the key things to consider when it comes to automating and using artificial intelligence while defending against cybercrime, and why there is such a strong place to automate, to simplify, and to have singularity when it comes to how you approach your cybercrime. This is critical to understand. You need to simplify and consolidate, because if these people are frustrated with the tools that they work with, they cannot defend your organization. So outside of your checklist, your people versus automation is one of your biggest considerations that you have to make.